To our session, she'll share some of her personal stories as well as insights gained during her period reporting in China in the early days of China's opening up. This timely session comes only a week after her book was released to the public. Before we begin, I must introduce the Washington State China Relations Council very briefly. We have our founder, Bob Kapp, on the phone, and the organization was, or our first president, I should say, Bob Kapp, when the organization was founded 41 years ago. We're here to help develop and improve relations between Washington State and China. We're a membership organization with members from business, government, educational, and cultural institutions, as well as individual members with an interest in China. Among our activities, we produce educational programs like today's webinar, foster connections on both sides of the Pacific, and provide advice for both business and government entities with their interactions with China. We also work actively with the local Chinese community on issues of common interest.
You are unmuted.
All right, hopefully, at the end of my comments, I will ask you all to mute yourself. But anyway, I do want to bring to your attention an email that went out today. Hopefully most of you received it, and it's about a fundraising drive that we're starting for our charitable organization, the Washington State China Relations Fund. This is the organization that supports the work of the council and helps produce all the programs that you enjoy. I would encourage you, if you could, to consider making donations so that we may continue our work. I'd like now to introduce Leslie Helm, who's a former journalist, author, and editor who's going to serve as the moderator for today's event. Leslie has been a business reporter for more than 3 decades, including 2 stints in Asia. First in Tokyo for BusinessWeek in the 1980s, and then in the 1990s for the Los Angeles Times. Most recently, he was the editor of the Seattle Business Magazine, a monthly publication that won awards during his decade of leadership. He is also the author of Yokohama Yankee, My Family's 5 Generations as Outsiders in Japan. And before we all start, please do put yourself on mute. There's a chat function at the bottom where you can send in questions. And then you can actually, once we go to Q&A at the end, if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, we'll make time available to do that. And now, Leslie, I'll turn the event over to you.
Thanks so much, Nor. Today, at a time when there's so much acrimony over trade with China, it's easy to forget how much excitement and mystery surrounded China's early efforts in the 1980s to break out of the straitjacket of communism and begin to introduce elements of the free market. Dori Jones Yang was there covering China for BusinessWeek during that momentous decade, and she describes in gripping detail how the story unfolded in her new book, When the Red Gates Opened, a memoir of China's reawakening. We're fortunate to have Dori here with us today to discuss her book. Her combination of language, education, economic chops, personal experience, and persistence has enabled her to write about China with rare depth and understanding. A graduate of Princeton, after studying intensive Chinese for 2 years at Singapore's Nanyang University, she earned a master's degree in international affairs from Johns Hopkins. As correspondent, she interviewed everyone from street vendors and factory managers to CEOs and powerful bureaucrats to write numerous influential cover stories for BusinessWeek. After nearly a decade as foreign correspondent, she moved to the Puget Sound in 1990, not long after she came here to give a speech at the Washington State China Relations Council and was struck by the region's beauty. Since coming to Seattle, Dori has written 8 books. Her first was a bestseller about Starbucks coffee, co-authored with Howard Schultz. Her many other books have focused on helping Americans better understand China. It's such a pleasure to be here with Dori today. I've known her since the early 1980s when we both covered Asia for BusinessWeek. She was a celebrity at the magazine, and I was a big fan of her work. Much later, we took book writing classes together. She read early versions of my book, Yokohama Yankee, while I had the privilege of being an early reader of her memoir, When the Red Gates Opened. I urge you to read this book. You'll find it fascinating, the way she weaves together China's transformation with her own relationship to the country in a way that sheds light on the importance of both personal and economic ties in our complex bilateral relationship. I should add, the book also happens to be a great read. Now, please join me in welcoming Dori. Dori?
I have to unmute. Thank you so much, Leslie, for that great introduction. I really appreciate it. Leslie and I go way back to the earliest times of our career. So what I wanted to do today is to start with a little bit of a talk about just about 15 minutes, because some of you know me well, some of you don't know me at all. And the book's only been out a week, so most people haven't had a chance to take a look at it. So just wanted to let you know a little bit more about what it's about. So I want to share screen so that I can show you a few pictures and hope that you can see what's there. You might have to move the parts of the pictures of the people around a little bit to see it, but as Leslie said, the book is called When the Red Gates Opened, with the subtitle of A Memoir of China's Reawakening, which actually Leslie helped me write. I had a different one, and he suggested the word reawakening. It's both a personal and a historical memoir of the 8 years that I spent in Hong Kong from 1982 to 1990. And it's personal in the sense that it's my own story and about being a young journalist at the time and trying to break into the field, and also meeting and marrying a Chinese man, and some of the setbacks that I had personally. And then it's also set in what I consider a pivotal moment of history. So that period of time in China was a time when China was just opening up, and it had gone from total isolation to opening to the rest of the world, and it had gone to very strict Maoist communism to allowing more and more elements of capitalism. So I really think that everything that's happened in China today really has just pivoted during that time. And I think that what it is really a microcosm, one person's story in the macrocosm of a larger history. So it's as historical fiction does, you can follow the story of the individual. I think many of you know a lot about China, others not so much, but I'm hoping that people who don't know much about China will get taken up, compelled by my story of just an individual, and then learn about a time and a place in the same way as happens in historical fiction. The book itself starts in Tiananmen Square, which was near the end of the time that I spent covering China. It was in 1989, of course, that the protests broke out there. And I tried to sort of set the scene of what was the biggest story I ever covered in my journalistic career. And there was, a lot of people forget that there were 6 weeks of protests before the crackdown. And it was actually kind of a joyful time and a time of possibility and openness. Then I also went, then at that point, in the book, I go back to the time of when I first became involved with China. And that was 10 years earlier. In 1979 was the time when the US and the People's Republic of China established diplomatic relations. And some of you will remember that the leader of China, Deng Xiaoping, came to Washington, came to the US, came to Seattle actually, as well as other places. And I happened to be a graduate student in Washington, DC at the time. And I was lucky enough to be at the Kennedy Center when they had that gala performance to welcome him. And it was a time, because China and the US had been in such hostile relations before that. And it just seemed like everything was opening up between the US and China. So a time of possibility and hope. I was really in the right place at the right time, I have to admit. Before that, American journalists were not allowed to be stationed in China. And after that, they were. And I was in a good position because I had a foundation both in journalism and also in China. So the background in journalism, my dad had a bookstore in Ohio, and he encouraged me not only in reading and writing, but also in journalism. He encouraged me to go into journalism, and I got a job with my local newspaper, the Youngstown Vindicator, when I was still in college, and worked at the Daily Princetonian all 4 years I was in college. And then later I joined the US-China Business Council, which Bob Kapp is very familiar with as well, and worked on their magazine, the China Business Review. And those were in a days when China business was almost a contradiction in terms, and we were just learning about it from scratch. So I had the background in journalism, and I also had a background in China. I had studied, as Leslie mentioned, I studied Mandarin Chinese in Singapore after college. It was actually 4 hours a day, 5 days a week. It was very, very intensive, which turns out to be a great way to study a really difficult language like Chinese. So I had a very good foundation by the time I left Singapore. And then I realized I loved the language, but I didn't know anything about the country. So I studied about China, getting a master's in international affairs at SAIS, Johns Hopkins SAIS. And at that time, every major business magazine and newspaper, because of Deng's visit, and they were all looking for reporters who had some experience in reporting, but knew a little bit about China. Nobody knew a lot about China. And BusinessWeek hired me. And I initially worked in New York for a year and a half, and then they sent me to Hong Kong as a bureau chief to cover China from there. China, about 4 months after I got there, I made what was my third trip to China, but it was actually my first trip as a reporter. And China in 1982, you can see from these pictures, and some of you will remember, there were statues of Mao, there were political slogans on the street. There were a lot of bicycles and not many cars. It was just very, very different kind of place than it is today. But it also, so it was about 80 or 90% of the people were living in poverty. It's hard to imagine. But they were just beginning to start to implement some of Deng Xiaoping's reforms. And those reforms allowed certain elements of private business, like this farmers market that we see here. So it was a combination of the old and the new. The new was just getting started. The other big story at the time, of course, was Hong Kong's future. So just a few months after I got there, Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of Britain, flew to Beijing to talk to China's leaders about the future of Hong Kong. Hong Kong was still a British colony, and as far as she was concerned, the lease was up in 1997, and she wanted to renew the lease. And Deng Xiaoping had different ideas. So that was a very big story, and my very first cover story was about the future of Hong Kong. And about a year after I got there, I met a handsome guy named Paul Yang, who's actually sitting right here in the room with me, and got to know him. And Paul was born in China at a time when the Kuomintang was still ruling, and his father was with the Chiang Kai-shek government. And so in 1949, when the communists took over, their family had to flee because they knew they would be in danger, and they went to Taiwan. So Paul went to high school and college in Taiwan, but then he came to the US in the 60s. So by the time I met him, he'd been in the US for about 20 years. He was a Chinese American, he was a US citizen already, but his parents still lived in Taiwan. So actually just a month after I met him, he took me back to visit his parents. And so I got to speak to them in Chinese and really kind of see China and Taiwan really from a Chinese perspective. Another big thing that was going on in the 80s was that people like Paul and his family had been separated from their families inside China for 30 years. And he was able to go back and find some relatives that they didn't know if their relatives were alive or dead. And he was able to reconnect with some of them and find some cousins that had not even been born when he left. The picture on the left, that's me in that fox fur hat, is of a village where his mother grew up. It was a very poor, small farm village in Hebei province. And I found out when I was there that I was the first Westerner who had ever been there. And so I was kind of privileged to be able to see parts of China that others weren't able to see at the time. The pictures on the right, the older woman there is actually Paul's sister, his half sister, who was left behind when the rest of the family went to Taiwan, because she was much older and she was already engaged to be married. And she had a very bitter and difficult life. And in getting to know her and seeing China from her point of view, I really gained an appreciation, an extra appreciation for what Deng Xiaoping was doing to make life better for ordinary people. In 1985, I wrote my second cover story, which really captured this whole sense of hope and optimism and euphoria that people had in about China at the time, both foreigners, Americans who were doing business there, although that had its ups and downs, but especially Chinese people. It was a chance for them to get access to consumer goods. If you remember those other pictures earlier, they had not, they had worn very dull colored clothes, and suddenly they had access to colorful clothing, and they were able to quit their jobs at state-run companies and go into business for themselves and just have choice about what they were doing with their lives. And at the same time, the Chinese government was even stricter then than it is now about not allowing foreign journalists like myself to travel throughout China without a Chinese minder, is what they called it. So basically someone from the Communist Party who would arrange all my trips and go with me to every single interview and interpret if needed. I usually didn't really need her, but occasionally would ask her for a word. And she would then, of course, write reports about me. And I knew that was happening. So I write a lot in the book about how I dealt with her. And we actually developed a pretty good working relationship. We were working on, we were rooting for different teams. She was rooting for the Communist Party and I was rooting for capitalism, but we ended up getting along pretty well. Somebody asked me recently who was my favorite interview while I was in China. And of course, I had a lot of really great interviews with different people, but there's a Professor Li Yining, maybe his name may be familiar to some of you, was known as Mr. Stock Market. And I remember just being amazed that a communist country would have a stock market, because there really is nothing more capitalist than selling shares in companies to individuals and allowing the means of production to be owned by private owners. And I got a chance to not just to interview him, but also get to know him when he came to visit Hong Kong. And then the real climax of the book is, and the climax of my 8 years there was Tiananmen Square. So as I mentioned earlier, in May of '89, there were 6 weeks of protests, and it was a time of incredible openness and freedom and possibility. Early in the '80s, it was hard for me to get people to speak to a foreign reporter, particularly about any kind of sensitive topic. And in May of '89, everybody talked to me about everything. And they were talking to each other about their opinions of the leaders of the country and things like that, that definitely had never happened before. And then, of course, we all know what happened in June of '89 when the Chinese army came in and used live ammunition to suppress what were peaceful protests. It had never turned into rioting. It was just peaceful protests all the way. But the Chinese army did open fire. And we fell into despair. We, meaning a lot of the Chinese people, certainly, but the American businesses just couldn't imagine how things were going to go forward. And Paul and I also just couldn't imagine how we could continue doing what we were doing. I didn't even want to contact some of the people I knew in China because I didn't want to get them in trouble. So it seemed like it was going to be a great leap backward, and China was never going to progress again, that all the exciting trends that we saw were over. But of course, as you know, they weren't, they started up again. So 3 years later, with his Southern tour, Deng Xiaoping started up the reforms again. American business came back. And then the story of after I left, so in 1990, Paul and I left, and I didn't cover China anymore as a reporter. I started covering other things and writing about other things. But Paul did go back quite a bit in the 90s and 2000s because he was doing business in China, and he was able to ride that wave up that we're all so familiar with. So just briefly, a few conclusions. I'm very humble when I realize that journalists' predictions are often wrong. We're often called to make a prediction. And when we do, there's written evidence of our lack of foresight. I wrote, from now on, it seemed China would be moving backward. And obviously, China didn't move backward for very long, and then moved forward in an amazing way after 1990. And also, China looks really different when you see it from the inside. And I tried hard as a journalist to convey that nuance and complexity. And I really tried to understand how the Chinese see the world. And I think that's really important. And it's very hard to write about that in US publications, to try to explain how they see the world. It's so often that we project on them what we think they must be thinking. And in fact, the more time you spend studying about China and living in China, the more you understand that they do see the world from a different point of view than we do. And I think it's important for mutual understanding to know that. And I do believe that no problem of worldwide concern can be solved unless Washington and Beijing find a way to work together. So I hope that we do. I found this chart very recently. This is the blue line is the unfavorable views of China. This is among ordinary American people, just people who answer a poll. And you can see that at 73% of Americans disapprove, have an unfavorable view of China today. And just a few years ago, it was in the 50s, and before that, it was in the 30s. There was definitely 10 years ago, a much more positive view of China than there is today. And so when I started writing this book about 6 years ago, American views of China were much more positive than they are today. So it's coming out at a time when the US views of China are very negative. I do believe I did leave China at a time of despair, but I would like to just end on a note of hope. And John Pomfret, who's an excellent journalist who wrote a book about the US and China relationship over several hundred years, had this to say, which I think really sums it up. Both sides experienced rapture, both the US and China, in other words, he's talking about the US and China over many years, experienced rapturous enchantment begetting hope, followed by disappointment, repulsion, and disgust, only to return to fascination again. So, as you know, we're in a period of disappointment, repulsion, and disgust. And the period that I wrote about was a time of rapturous enchantment. And I think that it's a pendulum that swings back and forth quite a bit. And I think we'll probably see it, we'll see another swing of the pendulum going forward. So just a little bit about the book. And then I think Leslie is going to start with some questions of his own, and then encourage everyone to write questions in the chat, because then he'll take your questions and make sure that I can answer at least some of them, or at least that I try to answer some of them. So Leslie, take it away. Okay, you're muted. Leslie, you're muted. Leslie. I need to unmute you. Okay, nope. You're still mute. Yeah, there you go.
There you go. Sorry. I wanted to start with a question about why now. It's been, a long time, over 3 decades since you were there and you had those experiences. Tell us a little bit about why it seemed important to tell the story now. But I also just wanted to throw in, since you've just been talking a little bit about your background, we have a question from Bill Holstein about what gave you the China bug and what made you want to go and study Chinese.
Well, thanks. That's a great question, Bill. I grew up in Ohio, as I said. I didn't know any Chinese people. I didn't know anything about China. But I loved learning foreign languages. So I was a bit of a language geek, and always interested in languages. And I wanted to live overseas after I graduated from college and spend a few years overseas before I went into my regular, I was hoping to go into a career in journalism. Someone had told me that it would be good to get some area expertise in a particular subject, and that would make it easier as a journalist to go into an area of journalism that I particularly liked. And so I got a fellowship from something called Princeton in Asia that sent me to Singapore for 2 years, and then I really fell in love with the language. And that's what got, once you put in that amount of effort, 4 hours a day, 5 days a week, then you really, that's what got me interested. So that's where the bug really got started.
Thanks. The second question also ties in with one of our, oh yeah, the question of the acrimony between China and the US, which reminds me a lot of the trade conflict with Japan when I was covering Japan, only seems deeper and broader today. How does your experience in the 80s, do you think, shed light on or help to view the tensions today in a new way? And we have a question from...
Let me answer that one first. I
right,
can only
okay,
take one question at a time, so save
sure.
that one. But I do think that what I was saying about the pendulum swinging back and forth, I think that that's one thing about the US and China that is different from, I don't know about Japan, but say India or Indonesia or a lot of other countries, is Americans feel passionate about China. They either passionately love it or passionately hate it. And they go back and forth, or I should say, we Americans go back and forth between these extremes. And sometimes the euphoria is overstated. I certainly got some pushback when I wrote that very euphoric cover story about capitalism in China, although it turns out that it turned out to be prophetic in some ways. But I also think that when we go negative, we also go to an extreme. So I think that that's, and also I've seen it not once, but twice really in my lifetime, because of course, when I grew up during the Cold War, where everything we heard about China was negative. And then in the 80s, things were getting more and more positive and euphoric at times. And then after Tiananmen Square, let's not forget that the US opinion, that chart I showed didn't go back to 1989. I think if it had, you would have seen a very high percentage of Americans in those days also who strongly disapproved of China. And then we didn't think that could possibly turn around, but it did turn around. So I think what I bring to current understanding of China is historic perspective.
And, you know, a similar question from Carolyn Brem. There's a question about, you know, how you're feeling about the current downward spiral in relations between the US and China.
Depressed, in a word.
And what needs to be done to swing the pendulum, yeah.
These last 2 years have been really rough for anyone who, well, particularly, I do believe very strongly, and a lot of my writing, I've tried to help Americans understand China better. And part of that comes from person-to-person interactions. And I think a lot of Americans went to China as tourists or to teach English or as students, and a lot of Chinese came here and Americans got to know them. And there were increasing interactions between individuals, and that always encourages mutual understanding. And one of the, in addition to Trump's policies, some of which, not all of which, but many of which I disagree with, because of COVID, because of the pandemic and the quarantine, we're not able to have that interaction. There's no tourism, there's almost no travel back and forth. And many of the Chinese students, some of the Chinese students have gone home. No American foreign exchange students are going to China. So when that all ends, then a lot of the people-to-people context, then the mutual understanding ends as well. So I'm feeling pretty bad about things right now. I do hope that once individual interactions begin, that some of that negativity will start to turn around. But I also think that we're heading into a totally new kind of relationship with China, which I could get into later.
You know, Paul Combs wonders whether a lot of the problems aren't coming from since the start of the Trump administration, or there are other factors that have caused the pendulum to swing in that negative direction.
I think that a lot of them have come under Trump. I do think that some of them predated Trump, and there were some growing concerns even in the Obama administration about Chinese hacking of private companies. They were talking with them about that at the time and trying to deal with it. And there are other examples as well. But one thing about Trump is just that he's been so combative and mercurial and erratic and blowing hot and cold. And yes, it keeps the Chinese, off balance, but I don't think it's been overall, certainly on trade, it hasn't been effective in achieving what he set out to achieve. The U.S. deficit with China, trade deficit with China has gone up, actually. It hasn't come down because of what he did. And also some of the other things that he was trying to do to force the Chinese to open up have not been effective either. So it certainly hasn't been very effective.
What about the impact or the views of American business in the business community? You saw you watched the early days of the American companies going into China. What were the attitudes towards tech transfer and market opportunities then, and how do you think that's changed now?
It's very interesting for me to write about tech transfer and back in the 80s, knowing what I know now. The Chinese were very open back in the 80s. They said, we want your technology. And the Americans were very open and they said, we want your market. And this is a classic example of sleeping in the same bed and dreaming different dreams. And I wrote about that a lot, even at the time and also in the book as well. And that continues to be true. We want their market. We want to be able to sell our cars and into their market and our luxury goods. But they want our technology. And I think the big difference is that back in the 80s, when the Chinese said, well, we want you to invest and bring your technology into these joint ventures, American companies were somewhat reluctant to do it, but they did transfer their technology. At that time, China was so unbelievably backward that yesterday's technology was great for them. And these companies could bring in yesterday's technology and it was brand new to them. But now the Chinese have gotten so sophisticated on their own that the technologies that they want are now our crown jewels, the best technologies that we have. And that's been an increasing cause of friction. But the change in views was really stunning to me because, of course, in the 90s and 2000s, U.S.-China was cheering on. U.S. business community was cheering on our relationship with China. They were the biggest cheerleaders. And then in the last 5 years, that changed. In the last 2 years in particular, that changed a great deal. And I think part of it is what I just said, but there's a lot of the Washington State China Relations Council had the authors of Superpower Showdown on recently, a few months ago. And that book, boy, that really lays it out why, in a way that was very enlightening to me, why the shift happened, that U.S. business, which had been so pro-China, gradually became not as clearly pro-China. Some of them still are, but many of them are not.
So you were based in Hong Kong much of the time you were covering China, and you saw the transition or the talks about the transition from from a colony to, moving towards a system, the two state, one China.
Mm-hmm.
There was tension then, and there's tension again now. I mean, what are the parallels between what was happening then and what's happening in Hong Kong today?
Well, that's a fascinating one too. And that's one too where I've seen the pendulum swing a couple of times. When I first got to Hong Kong in 1982 and those talks were just beginning, there was panic among the people with a little bit of money and people who were in business. A lot of them were trying to find foreign passports and invest in foreign countries. And in fact, that was Paul's first job when he got there to Hong Kong, was trying to sell US real estate to jittery Hong Kong investors. And then things calmed down a little bit when the agreement was signed, and a lot of Hong Kong companies got very interested in investing in China themselves. And then after Tiananmen Square, there was another huge outflow of Hong Kong people emigrating to Canada and Australia and all sorts of places. And then the pendulum swung back again. So we've seen that go back and forth, and now, of course, it's very negative. But I had two things that would really, I think, clarify a little bit what's happening there that I can bring to bear. And one of them is that when I was covering that issue in the 80s, Deng Xiaoping was very clear about what his goal was for Hong Kong. And it was stability and prosperity. And I remember hearing that at the time and really at first not thinking much of it, but thinking stability is that really your goal? His goal was not freedom and democracy for Hong Kong. That was never his goal. He never said that was his goal. His goal was stability and prosperity, and to maintain the stability and prosperity. And of course, we saw that stability in the last year with the protests actually going on for a long time, and to some extent getting out of hand. The stability of Hong Kong was endangered, and I think that's partly why the Chinese government reacted the way it did. And the second thing is about one country, two systems, as you mentioned. They wanted to, Deng's goal for that was to have sovereignty over China, over Hong Kong as well, and to get Hong Kong back. I mean, it's easy for us from our perspective to forget that Hong Kong was part of China for most of history, and then the British took it over basically by force, and that it was very humiliating for the Chinese, and they want to have their own territory back. And that is also the way they feel about Taiwan, that the US 7th Fleet came in and prevented them from reunifying with Taiwan. So their idea of one country, two systems was not, a democracy in Hong Kong and an autocracy in China. That really wasn't what they said. They said that they wanted to maintain stability and prosperity, and also to allow Hong Kong people to maintain their way of life. And their way of life at the time didn't include protesting in the streets, and that wasn't really what Deng had in mind. So it's just worth remembering. It doesn't make it any less tragic than it is, but it's worth having a little bit of historical perspective about it.
You do find in Hong Kong, though, that many people feel they don't really have a future. They've lived under one regime, and they feel like things are changing, and there's a sense of hopelessness among many. We have a question from Greg Uber, who's also asking about do you have any sense of how people in Taiwan are feeling, whether they feel sort of abandoned by the US, and how they feel, about what's going on in Hong Kong?
I think I haven't been to Taiwan for a while, so it's hard. But the main thing that I would say about both Hong Kong and Taiwan is that there's more of a difference of opinion than you would think from what we read in the papers. So you mentioned hopelessness in Hong Kong. For people in Hong Kong who were very idealistic and hopeful about democracy, absolutely, there's a sense of hopefulness. Hong Kong has always been about business. So for people who really care more about business, they're gonna have a fine future in Hong Kong. for the people who feel that sense of hopelessness, really, there isn't any hope for democracy. So some of them, I'm sure, will leave if they can. And in terms of Taiwan, I think it's also worth remembering that there are differences of opinion within Taiwan as well. There are some people who very, very firmly want Taiwan to be recognized as an independent country. And there are others who agree in principle that it should be the same, it's part of the same country as China. And they want to make sure that, that it's a peaceful transition and that they get to maintain as many of their freedoms as possible. But of course, after what happened in Hong Kong, it's much harder to make that point of view. It's much harder to have any hope about maintaining those freedoms.
Well, and Bill follows up with a question about whether you see the potential for a military confrontation over Taiwan.
I'm very worried about it. There certainly have been Chinese jets flying over the Taiwan Straits, and there's been a lot of propaganda put out by China to show that their military is very strong and they could take it over very quickly if they needed to. I think the Chinese would rather take it over peacefully, but with the current government in Taiwan, that seems less and less likely. And it's ultimately, really, there's not much the US can do. The US can put up somewhat of a fight, but if China wanted to take it over militarily, they could do it tomorrow. I hope they don't. A lot of people would be killed, and there would be a lot of resistance. You know that. There would be people who would be up in the hills and resisting from within. And I think there would be a lot more resistance in Taiwan than there will be even in Hong Kong, if that were to happen.
Can you talk a little bit about it? It's a fascinating part of your story. It's just the way you operated as a correspondent there. And it was obviously a difficult time to report, where people were having difficulty getting access to officials. Can you talk a little bit about your experiences there and how you reported your stories?
Sure. Reporting on China, there was really no playbook for it in the 80s. You really didn't. And the early 80s was different from the mid 80s, which was different from the late 80s. The rules kept changing. So one thing that I tried to, so I was a business reporter, so I really focused more on business, on US-China business, but also on entrepreneurship within China. And one thing I tried to do was, whenever possible, I had these interviews that were set up by the government, but I also talked, of course, to Americans who were much more open with me because they're used to talking about business with American business reporters and like talking to BusinessWeek. But I tried to talk to balance out those official interviews with people who were mouthing the party line with man in the street interviews. I tried to talk to ordinary citizens as much as I could. And as the 80s went on, people got more and more open. But even in the early 80s, I was able to talk to individuals, and then also to talk to Chinese entrepreneurs as there came to be more and more of them. They were small scale entrepreneurs compared to the billionaires that you see today. But they were willing, because US-China business was an open goal of both sides. They were perhaps more willing to talk to me, at least on those subjects, than they might have been if I had been covering dissidents or political changes. I mean, of course, political changes I did cover to some degree because that affects business. But I really, as a business reporter, I had a little bit different perspective.
Talking to reporters who've reported out of China recently, you hear how much more difficult it's become. I mean, their research assistants get thrown in jail. They have some serious problems. Do you get the sense at all that the red gate is closing again? That things are going to get more difficult?
Well, they certainly are extremely difficult, and it was totally depressing to see those excellent journalists, American journalists, being thrown out of China recently. And to me, as I mentioned, I think that the better mutual understanding we have, the better it is overall. And it's pretty hard to have any mutual understanding if you don't have excellent journalists in China reporting about what they see. But as far as the red gates, in terms of thinking about that, so of course the red gates is a metaphor that I used, and when I started going to China, they were very closed, and then they were opening up bit by bit. But one thing I noticed while I was covering China was that they would open up a bit and then they would close down a little bit, and then they'd open up a little more and then they'd close down. So there was this constant calibration going on. A lot of people don't remember the campaign against spiritual pollution or against bourgeois liberalization, but there would be these campaigns even in the 80s where it would start to open up, and then the conservatives would say, "Oh, wait a minute, I'm not so sure about that." And I would say they never completely flung all the way wide. There always has been there have been limits, as you know, as we're becoming more and more aware, in terms of what Americans and American business can do in China versus what Chinese business can do here. So they were never completely flung wide, but I do believe that, well, we know that since Xi Jinping came to power, that they've been gradually closing a little bit, and certainly a lot more focus on the state-owned sector and a lot less emphasis on the private entrepreneurs. And also the limits on the internet access. In the 90s, there were hardly any limits on internet access, and that the gates closed bit by bit on that too. So I would say that the gates have not shut tight the way that they had when I first started going there, but they've been closed. But I do think that they're calibrating it a bit. So they're closing a bit and then maybe recalibrating a little bit, closing a bit. I don't think that it's in their interest certainly it's not in their interest to close the gates entirely.
You know, back to the issue of business, Greg Uber asks what you think is the current state of entrepreneurship in China, and whether you expect strong competition in the strategic areas that China's identified, like 5G, AI, some of these high-tech areas.
I want to start by saying I'm not currently a journalist covering China, so what I have is an informed opinion. And as I'm sure a lot of people who are on this call have an even more informed opinion than I do, but it's clear that the private enterprise doesn't have the support of the central government as much as they did earlier. It's harder for them to get loans, and also we hear from what we know, there's a greater control. There's always been a Communist Party cell in every single company in China of a certain size, but the party is starting to exert some more control than they were before. And I think the question of technology is a somewhat different one. The high-tech sector is extremely competitive, and the winners won out against a lot of competition there. But it does seem like once there is a winner, that the Chinese government will help support that winner, even if it's a private company. So we are never in the US. I think that US policy has been to try to change the system in China. And I think that's a little naive to think. I mean, they don't come to our country and try to change our system. They have their system and it's working for them. And I think that we just need to protect our own technologies and maybe look as we are now, look a little more carefully at Chinese investments here, because our policy has always been the gates are flung wide open. And maybe now that China is, well, definitely now that China is a strategic competitor, as it is, we need to be more vigilant, and we do need to change our policies. I don't think we can go back to the era of engagement. the U.S. policy toward China was one of engagement under Republican and Democratic administrations over 3-4 decades. That's over. It's not just about Trump. It has to do with the fact that China is much richer and more powerful than it was, and it is more of a competitor. And I don't think it's an enemy. I don't think it should be treated as an enemy. If we treat them as an enemy, they'll act like an enemy. But if it's a competitor, we need to protect our industries, and we need to invest in R&D, and we need to invest in STEM education, science and technology, and really make sure that we've been taking our technological edge for granted for a long time. And I think we can't take it for granted anymore. We need to have proactive policies in the government. And I really hope that if there is a new administration in January that, well, already Biden, for instance, is saying that he wants to invest $300 billion in R&D. And I think the best way to deal with China is not to try to thwart it, but to try to outsmart it. And we got a lot of smart people in this country. And we've tried this about thwarting other countries. We certainly tried that with Japan in the 80s, as you know. And I think just thwarting another country certainly is not going to work with China. We have to strengthen our own industries and strengthen our own defenses as well, not just military, but espionage and technology protection. We need to be much more careful than we have. We got a little lazy. And for all the negative things about Trump, I think that his policies have made us, have kind of woken us up to the fact that we need to be more vigilant.
In your book, you were quite, you're quite positive about Deng Xiaoping and his role in Chinese history. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit, we have just a few minutes, but a little bit about leadership in China. Deng Xiaoping, how you assess him, but also how Xi Jinping has done, and how you see, his role and the potential for better times ahead under Xi.
Well, I'm a big fan of Deng Xiaoping. Obviously, his reputation was seriously tarnished when he gave the orders to open fire. There is no question that the Tiananmen Square massacre was because of his decision. But in terms of what he has done, aside from that, and not taking away from that, he has the changes that he brought about in China have rejuvenated the nation, have brought it to prosperity, and gotten rid of dire poverty almost completely. And I think that's really a good thing. But when in terms of today, one thing he did that he doesn't get a lot of credit for is that he instituted political change where every 10 years there was a change in leadership. And each group of leaders, it was also a group of leaders. It wasn't an individual. Even Deng was not a dictator. He had to respond to some of the other leaders, and he couldn't get his way all the time. So he instituted both group leadership and also a transition of power every 10 years. And with a transition of power, the leaders have to train up their successors. And under Xi Jinping, 2 years ago, he made himself president for life. He got that law passed, and that's ended. And I think that's extremely dangerous, and that worries me a great deal. So it's hard to imagine. I think that legacy of Deng has not been followed.
So we're down to only a few minutes, but there's a couple of questions that we have here. So I'll leave it up to you on who you want to question. But we have one question on COVID and the whole problems in China, COVID. But then there's a very long question from Robert Bob Cap that I'm going to have to read it because it's so long. I can't really summarize it. Could you comment on the dual forces pulling at all Americans, journalists, business people, and others who work in China? On the one hand, they have to try to tell people at home about Chinese reality as seen by you and by Chinese people on the ground. On the other hand, they have to be responsive to orders and views from central back at headquarters, including people interested in sales and marketing of the product to the American consumer. Could you reflect on that during your tenure in Hong Kong, China, and perhaps on how you see the problem looks today? The hard.
That's a great question, and it's asked from a business perspective, but I have to say from a journalistic perspective, that was true as well. One of my biggest frustrations while I was a journalist in China was being responsive to my own editors back in New York, who had a particular view and would sometimes oversimplify what I said. And at the time, BusinessWeek engaged in what we call group journalism. So every story, they weren't completely my stories, and if they made certain changes, I had only a limited amount of control over what the final story would be. So I often found that there was a particular perspective in New York, and I had to, the best I could do was modify it a little bit if I disagreed with it. So I have to say that I was, and it's interesting to hear that businesses were in that same position as well. And I think that's likely to continue, that dual pressure. And as a journalist, you want to tell the story with the complexities and the nuances that you see. And sometimes the editors want something simple that's easy for Americans to understand. And I do find as a consumer of journalism now that I often am frustrated by what I read, even before COVID, about China, because it does give one perspective, and I don't think it gives multiple perspectives, but it's a nature of journalism. You have to simplify.
Well, it is 5 now, but you have final thoughts on COVID? I mean, it is the issue of the day. I mean, are there on China's response and how they've done?
I think it's very interesting that, I mean, it's obvious that the Chinese didn't know what they were dealing with, and they, at whatever level, provincial or city or national, they quashed some of the efforts to try to report it publicly in the very earliest months. And but once they figured out what it was, they reacted very, very forcefully and clearly. And it's very interesting to me that they've gotten it pretty much under control, and they've used techniques that a lot of Americans wouldn't want to use. Although, frankly, if I had something on my phone that said I didn't have COVID and that it would allow me to go into public places where I knew that they didn't have COVID, I wouldn't personally mind that so much. Yeah. if it allowed the economy to grow again. And now we're seeing some very strong numbers for economic growth, and the currency is getting stronger as well, and it's one of the healthiest economies in the world. So, and it's because although they made some mistakes early on, they did crack down. And we in the US made some mistakes early on, and we didn't crack down, and the numbers tell the story. I mean, there are fewer than 5,000 deaths reported from COVID in China. If they underestimated terribly, maybe there were 10,000 deaths, and we've had 200,000. I think the numbers speak for themselves, and it's depressing.
Thanks so much, Dori. It's been a fascinating discussion. I encourage you all to read her book, When the Red Gates Opened. And Nora, do you want to close things up?
I did want to end on hope, but I didn't really want to end on the word depressing. But anyway,
no,
you
okay,
get the message.
Please.
No, that's okay.
Go ahead. Why don't you give your final
Well,
view
I mean, to end on COVID in this day, it's pretty hard.
Right.
But I do still hope that that there will be a way forward. I think it will be a number of years, and I don't think we will go back to the old relationship. But I hope that we'll get a more rational, reasonable relationship in the future that is good for America as well as China. Anyway, Nora?
No, a great discussion. I'm looking forward to reading the book. It was it was great to hear your insights, and I'm sure most people on the call would like to delve into them further. So thanks very much for sharing with us, and good luck with the book sales.
Well, thank you. I wish we'd had a chance to answer even more of the questions, but I appreciate you all being here. Thanks so much.
Great. Okay, thanks very much. Okay.